Just to introduce myself, my name's Rebecca Webster. I'm an associate at Forbes Solicitors. I am in the housing litigation team and I deal specifically with antisocial behaviour and housing management. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's going to be a really informative session this morning. We've got three speakers and myself, Darren Burton, who's the head of Housing Consultancy Services at ACS Forbes Solicitors. He will be speaking about multi-agency approaches, gaps, challenges, and achieving successful outcomes. And then we've got Danielle Bishop, Head of Community Safeguarding from Poplar HARCA. She will be speaking about safeguarding from an operational point of view, what they do as a team, their relationships with tenants and agencies, and how to use a safeguarding team. Then we've got Lindsay Barrett, who's the safeguarding lead for housing at Salford City Council, and she'll be going into detail about making effective referrals, the types of housing referrals that they regularly see, what needs to be considered, common barriers, and what an effective referral looks like. Then I'll be taking over and I'll be going through a little bit of the law, what kind of abuse there is, who are abusers, the role of the housing provider, and a couple of case studies. I'll also touch on the Mental Capacity Act just a little bit. So before I hand over to Darren, if I could have a next, thank you. Just what is safeguarding? So safeguarding means protecting an adult's right to live in safety, free from abuse, free from abuse and neglect. It is about people and organisations working together to prevent and stop both the risks and experiences of abuse or neglect, and at the same time making sure that the adult's well-being is promoted, and where it's appropriate, having regard to their views, wishes, feelings and beliefs in deciding on any action. So it is a person-led approach. Safeguarding is a person-led approach, and you'll see the effect of that throughout this presentation. I'll hand over to Darren now.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, everyone. I hope you've all enjoyed a nice Easter break. So my session today, I'm just going to be looking at the importance of multi-agency work in safeguarding and how that can impact on identifying gaps, dealing with challenges, and looking at policy development and achieving successful outcomes. So can the next slide, please, Catherine? Thank you. So I also kicked off with a bit of a definition. Now, this particular example is from Wikipedia. Lazy journalism, I know, and there could be a keyboard warrior somewhere in the world tweaking it as we speak, but I think getting the message across, I mean, it could use the Oxford English Dictionary or, you know, a copy of the Lancet or whatever, but if you look at this definition here, and there are many, safeguarding is a term used in the United Kingdom and Ireland to denote measures to protect the health, well-being and human rights of individuals, which allows people, especially children, young people and vulnerable adults, to live free from abuse, harm and neglect. So if you think about that, that just screams out the role of housing practitioners on a daily basis and everything that we have to deal with in the complex world of our communities. So if you look at, you know, providing the roof over someone's head, feeling safe in the street and in the wider neighbourhood, the rights to shelter, supporting vulnerable people, although it's important to add that not all residents of social housing are vulnerable, but it does take up a significant area of our work. So it just really highlights the importance of having housing around the table and what can be achieved when that knowledge and experience is part of a multi-agency approach. And I know the other guest speakers here today will be highlighting some of those examples and going into some more detail in their specialist fields. So I think that just really wanted to kick off with that. If you look at that paragraph, that quote, and it just highlights what we do on a daily basis and why housing is so integral to the safeguarding process. So if we can just have the next slide, please. So we're starting off here with, when does a multi-agency safeguarding process fall down? So something I'll be aware of, there's still fears around information sharing. I think that cuts across a lot of areas of work, safeguarding, dealing with antisocial behaviour, and a range of other issues. So That reluctance still comes about because different practitioners, different agencies basically don't want the fingers burnt if they share something that they shouldn't, even with the best intentions. So it's important for us as a sector to keep really banging home that message that safeguarding overrides everything in terms of the importance of sharing information, because ultimately people's lives can be at risk. And again, when we need that information, it's really experiencing and demonstrating why we need that information, who's going to have sight of it, how it's going to be used, where it's going to be stored. Those key principles really, and obviously linking in with GDPR teams as well. But, why do we need that piece of information to help keep someone safe, a family safe, an individual safe in our tenancies, in our wider communities? And it's still a barrier. There is improvements. And I think one of the things that we do notice, it does differ from region to region. So one of the main themes of this session today is about promoting that consistency across the sector. It shouldn't be down to geographical boundaries, really. There's also a perception that still exists as well that housing providers will proceed with legal enforcement action in the majority of cases. So, for example, if a support worker was to share some information about one of their clients, and again, the area of greyness between when someone is a victim and someone is a perpetrator, or both. So that can often skew the case management process, but it's about turning that on its head really and focusing on early intervention and support, and sustaining neighbourhoods as well. So, getting things right, helping people move forward with their lives, protecting people against harm, rather than just this, I suppose, ill-judged assumption that, if housing get involved, legal providers working on behalf of housing associations, it'll just result in evictions and injunctions. Yes, they are necessary, they're part of a bigger picture, but first and foremost, it's about protecting people and supporting people and helping them to move forward. This is probably a good one for some of our other guest speakers as well, but a lack of clarity around safeguarding thresholds and the escalation process, and this whole perception about, something that might be high for a housing provider in terms of vulnerability might not reach a particular threshold for social care professionals. So if it doesn't, it's important to have those discussions. Why doesn't it reach that threshold, and understanding that and be able to communicate it back to victims and for other agencies who you're working with, and to look at other opportunities, other options, what can be done to help move this case forward and address the issues, rather than simply saying, no, this threshold isn't met, and there's this period of almost silence within the case. So as things delay, a person's individual circumstances could be worsening. The threat of harm could be increasing as well, while all these delays are going on. So it's important to be proactive and to look at other options if a particular threshold isn't reached. So a lack of awareness around the roles and responsibilities of the housing sector, really. Does everyone know just the full variety and the full extent of what a housing practitioner does as well? And I think this sits well with the push from the white paper, and also some of the work the CIH are doing around the professionalisation of the sector as well. So, it is much more than just letting homes and collecting rent. And a lot of the skills and the services that are on offer do complement the work of other agencies, such as social care, environmental health, the police, and also working with the third sector charities, mental health professionals, and other agencies as well. So, safeguarding does cut across everything we do. Are policies fit for purpose, and do they reflect and support the management of issues in our neighbourhoods? I'll go into that in more detail in another slide, really, but it's really about that ownership of the policy. Does it meet the needs of the various client groups that we serve in our communities as well? And can we demonstrate that ownership throughout the organisation, not just on frontline delivery through housing officers, for example, or ASB officers, or the equivalent in your respective organisations? The last point on there I think is really key as well is, where does the in-house safeguarding offer fit? Is it matched by staffing capacity and resources? Because you might have an absolutely perfect policy there available on your websites, but if it can't be backed up in terms of staffing capacity and resources, then we're failing to meet the expectations of our clients, our tenants, and that can also spill over into service delivery failures, and also at a further level, non-compliance. So then the watchful eye of the Housing Ombudsman and the regulator becomes involved, and the picture gets really murky, both in terms of the risk to individuals who are at risk and the threat of safeguarding issues, but also organisational reputation as well. So a combination of both. So, that policy must be fit for purpose, and it must be backed up with the resources and the skills that you need to act upon concerns and reports of safeguarding. The next slide, please. In terms of collaborating safeguarding policies, having everyone involved, who can make a difference, who can contribute. So it's not a case of having a policy written in a particular office or somewhere within your organisation. It's got to have that input from anyone who can make a difference. So that's a clear message there. So as I touched on in the previous slide, demonstrate the ownership of the safeguarding agenda. So it can't be something that's just brought down off the shelf, and ultimately customers' lives could be at stake. So it's really got to have some purpose and some commitment, and obviously backed up with legal advice as well in terms of compliance with legislation. Maintaining and reviewing records of how these concerns have been recorded. So this just fits with a mantra of robust case management audit trails I'm sure you're all more than familiar with. Documenting that evidence has never been more important, particularly around safeguarding issues. So if a particular action isn't followed up, you've recommended it, you've done all you can from your piece of the jigsaw, then that's documented. And again, in the very worst scenarios of serious case reviews, your organisation has been compliant with your own policies, has delivered, has supported victims, and done everything they possibly can. And if there is a failure as part of the bigger picture, it doesn't rest with your own organisation. I know that's quite a sad thing to say as well, and it's about working in this multi-agency approach and having the strength of partnership. But it's also important that in terms of your own role within that, all the boxes have been ticked. Follow safe recruitment processes, including DBS checks. Now, if you look at it this way, I suppose we'd hope that it would never happen, but the risk of getting a bad allocation, someone being rehoused who could be a perpetrator, who could provide a safeguarding risk from an applicant point of view, it could be just the same with an employee as well. So again, those checks and balances as part of the wider organisational safeguarding model are really important. Maintain safe premises and equipment. So again, you could look at particularly communal blocks there as well, community facilities, community centres, that sort of thing as well. Does this pose an opportunity where a safeguarding risk could occur, and making sure that that all the checks and balances are taking place and it's a safe environment for people to meet. And also our own officers, I suppose, as well. If you're looking at safeguarding throughout, the safeguarding risk to staff. Make sure that all staff are aware of their responsibilities. So say this is linked really heavily to training. So I know often with training, we bring in external partner agencies. At Forbes, we do a lot of work with the Children's Society and a range of different domestic abuse specialists, for example, as well. And I think it's not just the training of the frontline housing officer, it's also equally important to other roles within the organisation. Say the finance director, for example, he or she needs to know the importance of safeguarding and the implications that has on the organisation. Reporting concerns promptly. This whole thing about getting in early and your gut instinct if something doesn't feel right. Where do you go with this? No one's expected to cross over a line into making diagnoses or, crossing sort of medical professional boundaries. But if something isn't right, you need to have those mechanisms in place internally and externally. I know as our fellow guest speakers will be sharing that in more detail, but where do we go with this? If something isn't right, then you've picked up on that. So it's a feeling you have, and where do you go with that? And ultimately, the earlier you can get in there, the better chance you have of turning the situation around and keeping people safe in the homes and in the community as well. Being alert to the symptoms of abuse, again, that links back to training as well. The whole thing about harm and neglect and everything that goes with it. Making provision for whistleblowing. You'd say that no organisation is above scrutiny. So if something's not right within a particular organisation, that person who's caught sight of that, who has evidence of something that's failing, that's dangerous, needs to be able to report it. Cooperate with investigations by social care, adults and children's, of course, and any other agencies as well. So again, that housing knowledge, the housing piece of the jigsaw is integral, and it's sharing that information safely, as we touched on in the previous slide. And that goes the same with working towards protection plans. and using that specialist knowledge of other agencies as well, rather than having our own internal ones in isolation. Communicating joint messages as well. So again, this fits in with that seat around the table that housing need to have in terms of community safety partnerships and attendance on safeguarding boards. Again, this can differ from region to region, often depending on the size of the organisation. So you may get a stock transfer landlord who has a seat around the children's safeguarding board perhaps, or in larger urban areas you may have one representative out of a number of different housing providers who feedback information and speak on behalf of their fellow organisations. But again, the housing representation is critical. So safeguarding does cut across these regional forums, and it's about being accessible and being part of that. Now, the next slide, please. So I know I've got a lot of policy experts here today as well, and I wouldn't hesitate to think that I was insulting your intelligence or anything, but I think it's worth covering this really just to go through. So what would you include in it? The purpose and scope of the policy in a statement, that clear vision of what your organisation can do in terms of tackling safeguarding, the legal framework that sits behind that, your compliance that supports your operational service delivery, and that reassurance that you've made those decisions, you're acting in a particular way, backing up your case management process with solid legal advice and representation there. What you believe, do you believe in the policy, the safeguarding policy that's in your organisation? Have you been part of its formation, its development, as we touched on earlier? And again, that is critical to have as many voices as possible, as many different views, expertise, recommendations, etc. So, if you've got a piece of paper, a policy there that you don't really believe in, how does that reflect when you go around to someone's home, or you interview a victim, or you're investigating a case? You've really got to buy into that. And I think that's a key message for the organisation, to make sure that all the employees, all the members of staff, support what's there, what's written, and act accordingly, and have that, that commitment and that passion for tackling safeguarding. And again, how you'll recognise the signs. How does your organisation keep young people, children and vulnerable adults safe? What do you actually do? What resources are available? What's your commitment? And really promoting that as widely as possible. How does safeguarding link to any other related policies? So as we said, it cuts across everything really. So it could link to your hoarding policy, your domestic abuse policy, your allocations policy, and even repairs as well. So, the full remit of a housing professional. So it's making sure that those policies do actually complement each other and can be delivered as part of a twin track approach when it's appropriate to do so. And the contact details of anyone, if someone wants to report some safeguarding issues as well. So, a safeguarding lead, a safeguarding champion at a local level perhaps, and making sure that that's accessible. So if there's a safeguarding emergency, are the direct numbers, direct emails available for that person to contact? Is there an out of office service? Is there a simple app that someone can use? So making sure that if someone does have the courage to report safeguarding issues, then that can be dealt with swiftly, rather than them being put off for figure of delays or certain barriers that they may encounter when trying to access these services. On the next slide, please. Just some continuing on from the last slide regarding the content of the policy. So what would you do if there's an incident, an allegation or concerns? Your responsibilities, what do you do when someone comes to you and reports a safeguarding issue? And again, it's very much being on the front foot, having that advice at your disposal, rather than having to refer to multiple people, encounter delays. The clock's ticking basically with safeguarding issues, as I'm sure you'll all agree. So it's getting that advice straight away and getting that full wraparound support depending on the level of risk. Being clear on the definitions of abuse, harm and neglect. Now, disciplinary procedures are in place when incidents happen or allegations are made or things aren't done. Now, that's a bit of guidance I put in there that actually come from the NSPCC, but again, it's useful to note. So again, it's that's accountability. It's not about looking at blame culture or anything like that, but it's just the severity of safeguarding that I put that in there, that disciplinary procedures can and will be in place if failures have taken place. So that's something to be mindful of. How do you record the incidents? Where are they recorded as well? And how would they be disclosed? That's important as well. So again, it goes back to that case management audit trail and having all the details there. Who's responsible for recording them? And the do's and don'ts, advice to employees. So again, everyone's clear, and all this goes back to the ownership of the policy and being having that training, being fully familiar with what you need to do and comfortable as well. So you're not put on the spot making any incorrect recommendations to someone, giving incorrect advice, or not being able to give any advice at all. And something that's really important as well, more so than ever, and I know more organisations are trying it now, it's feedback and input from victims. So, you know, how can that lived experience shape policy going forward? I know some regions have survivor panels in regard to domestic abuse, for example, as well. So people who've been through the process, they may have had a positive response, they may have had a negative one as well. So it's sharing that knowledge when someone's been in that situation, what can be learned and how can that shape the policy for that organisation or that wider partnership. So again, it's reaching out, not in a tokenistic way. And again, it's got to be people who are comfortable sharing the story. And often it's part of, you know, addressing the process, the healing process for people who've been through those ordeals as well, to make sure that it doesn't happen to others, or to play their part to prevent that happening to other people as well. So that's something that's definitely working well. And there's a lot of examples in different parts of the country where that's, you know, there's some successful outcomes there. So where people are willing to share their story, to share their experience, I think should be embraced. So the next slide, please. A case study for you when things work out right, which is what I like to see, don't we? So this is one from, it's a Northwest region, this one. But so I'll just go through a few bullet points of the situation. So a vulnerable female in a relationship with a violent male, and the male in question had a significant criminal history. So again, that shows the complexities from the very beginning. To add to that, further complexities, the male was a vulnerable adult care leaver with mental health condition and a personality disorder. So again, the safeguarding thread's already there, and there's not going to be a quick fix when you look at it like that in black and white on paper. So it's going to be a lot of different agency supports. It's going to be a wider approach in terms of case management. You can't just look at that and make a decision and say, right, this is what we need to do, because it's about getting the full backstory. And again, working with people with criminal history or with mental health issues, how have they arrived at that situation? You know, and it's learning about that backstory can be pivotal to achieving successful outcomes. So the female was a sole tenant living in a block of flats. There was reports of domestic abuse, threats to neighbouring residents, and also threats to burn down the building. So severe, needs to be acted upon. In terms of partnership working, this organisation worked with the police, worked with social care and mental health agencies to gather information. An ex parte injunction was made to exclude the male from the building. We also worked with the fire service in regard to target hardening, advice to neighbours around fire safety and escape strategies, given that threat and the fact that it was a block of flats as well. So again, that's being proactive and looking at other approaches as well as the legal intervention. So the injunction exclusion was granted and the male was prevented from returning to the building because of the issues highlighted above. In terms of support, it was also recognised naturally that support was needed for the male in question, and the social work was on standby to offer this support as he had a tenancy elsewhere. So again, it wasn't just dealing with this person exclusively as a perpetrator, but also looking at support as well. And the police assisted in serving the order and also patrolling the area to give that reassurance and that comfort and support to other residents in the area who've been threatened. The next slide, please. Okay. So in terms of best practice, something we're very strong on at Forbes as well, promoting best practice from a range of different organisations. So if something works well, share it. And as I said before, geography shouldn't be a barrier. So if it works well in one area, the principles are pretty much the same. So what's stopping us from liaising with different social care teams in another part of the country, different police forces and other agencies to share that and to look at how we can create positive outcomes elsewhere, really. And it's all about consistency. There is a long way to go in terms of that, but a lot of positive signs. And I think one of the positive signs is the way that this experience and knowledge is shared throughout the housing sector as well, and it can only be a good thing, and continue. Next slide, please. Well, this is where things haven't gone quite so well, but I think it's always useful to have a balance. So there was a vulnerable adult defendant, again, with complex mental health issues. So, that whole awareness of mental health and safeguarding is often intertwined. Living in supported accommodation, a shared house. So the defendant threatened a member of staff with a knife in a communal area before damaging the member of staff's car. So again, the safeguarding risk to the staff member as well, not just other residents. Later attacked the member of staff again and got in a headlock. So again, the distress that's caused. The person was arrested but returned to the property, and staff and other vulnerable residents were still at risk. The risk wasn't addressed at that time, when really you'd have hoped that interventions would have been put in place to give that reassurance and to address it as early as possible. So the client made urgent contact with the defendant's social worker to gather information, again to try and identify this backstory, to put interventions in place and how best to proceed. Unfortunately, in this particular case, the social worker was unwilling to share information regarding diagnoses, etc. And again, it's not so much about having that medical knowledge, it's just about what we need in terms of information sharing to put things right from a housing perspective as part of the bigger picture. But this information, unfortunately, at that stage of the process wasn't forthcoming. So the social worker refused to work alongside the client housing provider to achieve a positive result. So basically that just almost forced legal action. Now, legal action may have happened anyway, but it shouldn't have been the sole remedy. So legal action was followed in this case. Can I next slide, please? The social worker advised that in the absence of any evidence, the client would just have to presume capacity and continue with legal action and excluding the defendant from the building. It was only at this stage when, again, that perception of someone losing the home triggered the social worker to engage, and ultimately that particular individual was found alternative accommodation elsewhere. So again, legal intervention was almost used to as an outcome there to rehouse that particular individual. But again, what's to say that those issues didn't move with him, and they could happen elsewhere, put other people at risk. So whilst the harm was taken away from that particular locality, doesn't mean that it was fully addressed. So not a good example as it should have been, really. But again, it's just to highlight, and I'm sure you've come across those examples as well as many positive ones in your own respective areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is what I'm going to kind of finish off with now. So serious case reviews and lessons learned. It's about what can we demonstrate in terms of the learning from serious case reviews. And I think with housing providers as well, recently, certainly over the last few years, do the specialist teams really link together, and is that information shared? Sometimes it can be missed as well. So if the rents team, the income team have some knowledge, has that been cascaded to the ASB team and vice versa? And could there be any gaps there that could have contributed towards a missed opportunity in preventing that death in that particular situation? Has housing done something wrong in terms of the process rather than actual actions? Has the not doing been a problem in terms of reporting? How are issues recorded? Do the CRM systems talk to different police databases, for example? And is there more that we can do in terms of our case management systems, talking to partnership intelligence portals for local police services and sharing that information safely? Are there any gaps there that we need to be made aware of as well? So these are the things just to point out and to be vigilant about. And I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but it's just really to have those checks and balances in place at all times, just to kind of make ourselves aware. Okay, so I think that's it from me. There's a slide there. Yeah, so if anyone does have any questions for me personally now, or if you want to contact me after, or if you think of anything later on, then by all means don't hesitate to get in touch. So thanks for your time, everyone. I'll hand you back to Rebecca. Thanks.
Thank you, Darren. Very, very informative. Thank you. Just want to say, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, can you please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen? I forgot to mention that at the beginning of the presentation. So thank you again, Darren. And now I'm going to pass over to Danielle.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, so my name's Danielle Bishop and I'm the head of community safeguarding at Poplar Harker Housing Association. I am responsible for the safeguarding function and the community safety function within Poplar Harker. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about us. We're based in East London in Poplar, as the name says. We're a housing and regeneration community association. So obviously, first and foremost, we're a housing provider, but we concentrate on regenerating areas in the community to provide more housing, make sure the estates are as good as they can be, and ensuring that our residents have a safe place to live. We've been set up since 1998. The ASB team, as it was then, started off with one member of the team, and we've grown from then. And we now have just over 10,000 properties. We are based in Poplar, but we do now go just down to the Isle of Dogs as well. We've got a small development, so it's a bit of a change down there, different dynamics that we're kind of learning to adapt to as well. Next slide, please. So just a bit of a visual idea for you about our estates. As you can see, we are well placed to Bank, to Canary Wharf. We're close to very affluent areas, but as many of you may know, in Tower Hamlets and Poplar is a very deprived area. So it's about generating the community and providing support to all of our residents where possible. But the one good thing that we have that helps us as a safeguarding team especially is our small geographical area. We're set across 4 square miles, our properties. You can get from one corner to the other of the estates in about half an hour on foot, and even quicker by public transport. So for our safeguarding team, it means that they can be where they need to be when they need to be. So obviously during the pandemic, it was difficult not being in our office in the estates, but pre-pandemic and back to it again now, if we're in the office, if there's an issue, if a resident needs us, we can be there in a very short space of time, which really means that we can be a real reactive service as well. Next slide, please. Oh, back one. I think we missed one. Oh, anyway, we'll just carry on with this one. So yeah, our team, we've got a team of 12 covering safeguarding and enforcement or community safety. So our safeguarding team comprises of 2 safeguarding officers who deal with all safeguarding, so hoarding, mental health, drug and alcohol support, anyone that with additional needs that needs support to access services. And then we have a domestic abuse and safeguarding coordinator who deals with the high level safeguarding, but her main and principal role is the domestic abuse work with our residents. And then on the enforcement side, we have 3 ASB officers who deal with the enforcement. So taking action against perpetrators, investigating ASB complaints, and doing the legal work where necessary. And then we have 2 witness and victim advocates who are the voice of the victim. They are the main contact for the victims of ASB. The calls come through to them, they take the reports, they discuss with the ASB officer. And I think one of my witness and victim advocates uses it, the analogy he uses as a game of tennis. So he will bat the problem over to the ASB officer will investigate, bat the updates back, and they just keep the dialogue live. And that, I think, is the key to ensuring that we're taking action and safeguarding the residents as much as possible. And the good thing is the team work as one. Although they have separate functions, the community safeguarding team work together. The safeguarding team are involved where necessary. I know Darren was talking about, obviously, perpetrators having safeguarding needs as well. So where that's necessary, our safeguarding team will get involved. They will liaise with services. They will attend meetings where necessary and ensure we've got a full picture where needed. In 2020, we did win the Housing Heroes Award for Care and Support, the safeguarding team. Very much deserved, I felt, after the pandemic and all the efforts that the team went to during that time. We spoke to over 3,000 residents during the first 4 months. just to touch base, see what they needed and put plans in place, whether that was hot meals, whether that was care needs, whether that was visits, and we were able to really put good plans around them. Next slide, please. So despite me talking about the community safeguarding team and what the safeguarding team specifically do, the safeguarding team can't work without the rest of the business being on board. And as everyone says, it's everyone's business, safeguarding. Everyone that works in our organisation has a responsibility to adults that are at risk of abuse. And we as a team, we hold every 2 to 3 years safeguarding training for the whole business. So that includes our contractors as we outsource repairs. And for us, our estate services, the guys that are in the blocks, cleaning the blocks, doing the repairs, they are our eyes and ears, because they are the ones on the estates all the time. They're visiting the same blocks, they're seeing any concerns, they're seeing any changes, and for them to report to us and know what they're looking for helps us hugely. So we find that the safeguarding training really spurs people on to know what they're looking for and communicating with us when necessary, what's going on and where we may need to help. As I say, obviously well-being is at the heart of all what we do. We want our residents to feel safe, secure, have the support they need. As I said, we're so well placed to identify people at risk of abuse, and it's been said several times, but as housing providers, we have access to people's homes. And I think if people are at risk of abuse, generally they're a higher percentage of risk in their homes. When we see ASB, if we see patterns of rough sleepers and drug users, we need to consider cuckooing. We've had multiple cases of vulnerable adults being taken advantage of because people are posing as carers, financial abuse, and getting into their properties and using it for their means. So it's about being proactive. And that's what I'm saying when it comes to estate services. We want them to contact us. What I always say to anyone in our business is, we have a safeguarding team inbox, and I would rather receive 100 emails a day and 85% of them be not for us than not receive the emails and miss things. And I think it's good for us to be able to look at things and determine what action is needed next. And as I say, any concern should trigger a response in every case. And that's what we try to ensure happens. And when we're linking in with the ASB team, it's about saying, right, this person is a perpetrator of ASB. What have you asked them? What is their home environment like, if safe to do so? And is there anything that is maybe causing the ASB as well? For example, we have a guy who's a noise perpetrator. Upon going to his first floor property, he's got wooden flooring, but the noise is because he's on crutches, and if he has carpet, then he's at more risk of falling over and hurting himself. Therefore, it's about, right, what options next? And how can we ensure he's got a safe environment, but also his neighbour isn't disturbed by noise? So it's working together to kind of ensure that we're getting to the bottom of things there. And we also work very closely with our housing team and our lettings team. If a tenant is due to sign up for a new property and they've got vulnerabilities, either that they've disclosed themselves or have been disclosed by the referring person or the Tower Hamlets Council, one of the safeguarding team can be present at sign up and can be their contact for the start of their tenancy to ensure that they know how to access their benefits, how to access support if it's a new borough for them, and if it's not a new borough, is the property suitable for them? So it's about making sure we're there from the get-go and that they know what services we provide and how they can access them. Next slide, please. So as I said, a huge part of the work of our domestic abuse and safeguarding coordinator is tackling domestic abuse. We sit on the domestic abuse MARIC in the borough. We promote our domestic abuse services to get victims contacting us. Early intervention is key, and as I'm sure many people know, so it's about, here are your options, what do you want to do next? And providing the practical and emotional support. And if we can't do it, it's about letting them know the people that can and making the appropriate referrals. And what I would say is when I first came to Poplar Harker, the domestic abuse and safeguarding role was my role. That's what I came here for. And I've worked in domestic abuse for years. And I think it has changed significantly. It was to be giving options and supporting the victim and giving them housing options and saying how they can keep themselves safe, which we still do. But it's kind of changing to more of an advocate role. What we've seen is when children's services get involved, if there are children in the relationship, they are seriously focused on the well-being of the child, and so they should be. But what we've seen is the victim, the parent, will sit in these meetings and their voice is kind of forgotten. So what we find is that having the support of us is kind of like a neutral person to be able to support that victim, male or female, to get their voice across and ensure that their well-being and welfare is taken into account as well. So this role has become something much bigger than it was ever intended, but I think the outcomes are shown in the support that the victims feel that they have and that the outcomes they get, which is amazing for all of us to see. Next slide, please. And hoarding is such a huge part of what we do. When Poplar Harker was created in '98, it was a huge stock transfer from the council. So a lot of the people in our properties that has been their home for 30, 40 years. And sometimes they can go under the radar. They report their repairs. They keep their doors shut. They know how to ensure that people don't see what's in their property. Now, after the Grenfell tragedy, as many housing providers did, we started doing fire audits and fire assessments, going to people's properties, ensuring that they've got smoke detectors and their property was safe. And through that, we had such a huge amount of hoarders come to the surface. And therefore, our safeguarding team were able to put support in and support them to clear their properties. And we are hoping to run that again in the next year or so, because it was so beneficial to us to be able to support these people to make sure their homes were safe. As you can see in these images here, there is a clear difference. This lady, she collects things. As you can see, the property is full of new items. And actually what she was trying to do was send these back to her family. And so we were able to support her to do that. The safeguarding officers will go to tenants' properties. They will spend a few hours there helping them clear a few bags at a time, setting them targets. So you've got 2 weeks to make sure that you can open all of your doors fully, that they don't hit an item behind the door, that we can get into them. And it's setting the small targets so it doesn't seem so daunting. I think there's an idea that, oh, well, you can go in and just clean the whole property. Well, you can do, but they're going to hoard again because we've not dealt with the root problem. So it's about us as the landlord working with services, working with adult social care, working with the hoarding panel, which we attend, and ensuring that we've got the support in place for these residents where needed. So hoarding is such a huge part of what we do, and it's something that we've seen fantastic results in, and residents being so appreciative of the support that we can provide. And the way I always frame our safeguarding team is we come in, we do a piece of work, and we're the middleman. So you're not getting support for your physical health, so let's get you linked in with that. You're not getting support for your mental health, let's get you linked in with that. You want to go out in the community more, okay, let's put you in touch with services. And what we want to do is we want to do a piece of work and leave that person in a better position than they were in at the start. Some cases can be open for a matter of weeks, some cases are open months, and then when you're looking at residents that are hoarders, you're looking at maybe a couple of years and longer, because we want to make sure that this isn't a quick fix, but that we're getting them to a point where they can actually live in a safe environment. Next slide, please. And here's just a quick case study. A resident of ours, and as I say, we get them involved in things to make sure that they don't return, because you can never predict that. And if they do return to the way their life was before, we will support them. But Clive, after we'd worked with him, he's getting the right benefits, ensuring that his disability is taken into account, getting support with drug and alcohol addiction, and we will attend those appointments with them in the first instance to make sure that they're getting to those. Involved in the local community garden and meeting other people, engaging well with support workers, seeking employment and sustaining his tenancy, because that is our aim. We want people to sustain their tenancy and be able to live there for as long as they want to. Next slide, please. And just another case study. One of our tenants was seriously isolated in a wheelchair and lived on the 8th floor. She was unable to leave the property on her own. She had to wait for friends to support her. All she wanted to do was move, but she didn't know how to do that. We were able to work with her and find housing on a ground floor. She could access the garden unaided. She was able to get a pet so that she could have some company. She was in touch with our welfare benefits specialist, who secured her a large sum of money. And she said that she felt like her life has started again and that she was happy. And I think all we look to do is support our residents to be happy and be safe at home. And safeguarding isn't just for a short period of time. We open a case, we work with them, we close that case, but we're always on hand. Some of our domestic violence victims, we close that case, but we check in with them every fortnight. And what I want to stress as well is what we do is very resident led. You tell us how often you want us to call you. We're not going to bombard you a couple of times a week, weekly, if that's not what you want. How do you want us to support you and how can we work with you? And that's kind of the relationships that we want to build with our residents. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, we have a contract with Park Guard, who are our security team who patrol every day for 10 hours from 2 till midnight. During the pandemic, Park Guard were our absolute saviour. They were going and doing welfare visits. They were checking in on residents when we couldn't contact them. They were able to let us know what was going on in the community. But also with the community safety side of things, they're able to issue ASB warnings and make sure that the community is safe. And we continue to work with them where necessary. They will still do welfare visits. If we get something from repairs that they've been trying to contact someone due to a leak and we're not on site, we're able to get Park Guard to go and check on them, obtain phone numbers and really support us. So it's just a huge bonus for our team to have that, and it's and out of hours support as well when we're not there in the office. Next slide, please. And yeah, to end, the future of our service. As I said, we really want to focus on early support and intervention, making sure that we're catching issues early and working with our residents. We want to look at more specialist roles within the safeguarding team. So whether that's someone that focuses solely on mental health or drug and alcohol support, and really being able to do huge pieces of work with the residents, but also with our partners. And looking at specialist services into our team, who can support us to do our work, and how can that benefit the service we provide, but also changing the landscape of our enforcement team and the local policing, and how can we work with our local safer neighbourhoods team to make sure that vulnerable residents, if they are potentially ASB perpetrators, that we are working with them early on and ensuring that we explore the roles fully. But yeah, that's a whistle-stop tour as to what we do at Poplar Harker. As Darren said, any questions, please put them in the Q&A function and I'll answer them, or just get in contact with me if you've got any other questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. That was an excellent example of how a dedicated safeguarding team can provide a reactive service to enable tenants to be safe from the outset of the tenancy. It's amazing work that you're doing. Brilliant. Thank you. So next, we're moving on to Lindsay, if she's around.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
I'm here.
I'll pass over to you. Thanks, Lindsay. Take it away.
All right, thanks very much. Okay, I realise I've got a lot to fit in a short space of time, so I'll try and do my best. But just to, thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name's Lindsay Barrett and I'm Safeguarding Lead for Housing within Salford City Council. My job actually came around in 2009 as a result of 2 safeguarding incidents, one where there was a death of a 2-year-old child and another where there was an elderly lady who was living in a state of disrepair, and there were concerns about the property condition and her health and well-being living there and her safety. And kind of what's happened since then has been lots of changes in the world of housing, and as a result of those 2 cases there was confusion around how do you get to the right person in housing, because quite often housing is seen as as a homogenous group. You know, you'll see when it's written down referred to housing or sent to housing, contacted housing, but it's never really specific about who, which service, kind of which organisation, and the role of that person. So my role was to try and strengthen really safeguarding across the housing sector in Salford, and it's based within the City Council, so but works very, very closely with all our registered providers and works very closely with our in-house housing support services. And all with the aim of, I guess, trying to help partners navigate around housing, and making sure that our adults and children are protected, and the safeguarding kind of agenda is really, really kind of well embedded and well established across the housing sector. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what I wanted to cover today really, hopefully I'll have enough time, is just really touching upon the different types of referrals that you might come across in housing. It's not an exhaustive list, but some of them you might be familiar with and might recognise, and some of these really are the ones where it's really difficult and challenging, and can be often frustrating because they may not get over the front door. So I just wanted to kind of pick up on some of those. I'll look up the Care Act very, very briefly in terms of, you know, the safeguarding duty and who is owed that duty, and really to get you thinking about, this is a piece of legislation that's there, there's a framework that's there, and it's there to help us. It replaced no secrets guidance that really wasn't helpful. And this piece of legislation, I think for housing, works really well because it means that the threshold for safeguarding has come down. And it means that, you know, we can use it to our advantage and to support sometimes those tricky referrals that we're trying to put through to our safeguarding hubs. And then what needs to be considered when you're making a referral. So just really touching upon some of the key principles of the Care Act and what that means when you're making a referral, and hopefully that would support you and assist you in getting it over the front door, so it's not getting bounced back out and back to you. And then looking briefly at the barriers, I think Darren picked up on it earlier about information sharing and confidentiality. That's the kind of main barrier that I'll be looking at. But again, when is it lawful to share information without the consent of the adult? So when can you do that? And what are the different circumstances when that's okay to do? Then looking at what an effective referral looks like, and when it works well, kind of, there's 3 examples there. So next slide, please. Okay, so the safeguarding, getting it over the front door. So what I would say is it's really important to make sure that you're aware of your local authority referral pathway. It should be in your policies and procedures, your safeguarding policies and procedures. So where do they go to referrals? Is it a specific team? Is it a multi-agency safeguarding hub? Is it via an online referral? Is it submitted via an email to a specific email address? Do you know the telephone numbers and the out of hours telephone numbers as well? All these things is really good to familiarise yourself with your organisation's policy and procedure and your local arrangements, and making sure that if you've got properties across a number of different local authority areas, that they may well have slightly different procedures or maybe have a slightly different way of making referrals in, and it's really important that staff kind of are familiar with what's the process within that local authority. So thinking about some of the types of cases that you may come across where you're needing or wanting to make a safeguarding referral, and like I said, this list isn't exhaustive, but in Salford what we found is that we have quite some homeless and rough sleepers with very, very complex needs, and they weren't getting beyond the front door because the person they wouldn't engage with when they'd get a call from adult social care, and they were deemed to have capacity. So that was it, that was the case closed. What we're seeing quite a lot of also is self-neglect cases. We're seeing this more and more where hoarding can be quite common. And also something that we're really, really seeing now is adults with vulnerabilities living in their home, but where there's no gas supply to the property. So no hot water, no heating, and no gas supply. And this may not kind of come up as a safeguarding inquiry, but it certainly should go through, I think, as a safeguarding referral. It does come under the Care Act, self-neglect, and you know, it would be dealt with as an assessment and on a case-by-case basis. Another example would be around the cuckooing and the exploitation agenda, and the emerging area and what we're seeing there. Again in Salford, it's highlighted the gaps that we've got in terms of responding to those cases. So rather than them being seen as antisocial behaviour cases, we need to be thinking about them as a vulnerable person, and sometimes an exploited person right at the centre of that. And we're looking at multi-agency practice guidance that's being developed, and housing really does play a key role in this area of work, and kind of making sure that you as in your organisation are involved around that agenda. And then one that's fairly common and very sad really, but often it can be an elderly tenant and somebody who's being financially abused by somebody who might be quite close to them. So it could be a family member, it could be a close friend, but it may well be that's the only person that visits that tenant. So for them to disclose their concern about being financially abused, or that they might be missing money, or their bank card is being used without their consent, actually runs the risk of that person then being further isolated if then it leads to a safeguarding inquiry and action being taken. So I'm going to touch on this a bit further along about what does the person want to happen, and it not all being a process led, and it's about what's the best outcome for the victim in this really, and what do they want to happen. I've got on there suicide threats or suicide attempts, and the reason I've put that on there is because you might be seeing this more and more, you might be experiencing this more and more. And what happened in Salford was originally we were seeing concerns being put through to the adult social care as a adult safeguarding concern, and really they were coming back out because it wasn't the most appropriate pathway. That referral pathway is there for adult safeguarding concerns, and what we've done a lot of work in Salford is to really work with our housing colleagues and housing staff to rethink about suicide threats and attempts, and think of it more as in terms of it that a medical response is required. So trying to direct people to their GP or to the A&E, to the crisis team, and that for them to put in an adult safeguarding referral, it can trigger a whole load of work that actually doesn't go anywhere, and doesn't end up with the right team that can then take action. And we've had to work really hard on that, but whilst still acknowledging that it can be quite staff can carry a lot of anxiety around if they're working with tenants who might have attempted suicide or making suicide threats, and feel like they need to tell somebody, they need to share this, and they need somebody to know about it in case it happened. And that's right, that does need to happen, but not necessarily down the adult safeguarding referral pathway route. Next slide, please. Okay, so safeguarding inquiry. So touching upon the Care Act here, and how can you use it, and what's the threshold? I know Darren mentioned again before about the kind of application of the different thresholds maybe in different areas. But just to say that there's a piece of legislation, and safeguarding is a standalone duty. So it doesn't mean that the adult that you're concerned about has to be eligible or in receipt of care and support, a care and support package. So it's not linked. It's not linked to them receiving a service. If an adult, if there's reasonable cause to suspect that an adult has care and support needs, and that's really important word in there, reasonable cause to suspect. It doesn't say that they've had to have been assessed as having care and support needs. And then there's concern that that adult is at risk of harm or abuse, then that duty would apply. And on the slide there, there's different scenarios there. So when an adult with care and support needs may be an older person, a person with a physical or learning difficulty or sensory impairment, somebody who has mental health needs, including dementia or personality disorder, a person with long-term health conditions, or someone who misuses substances or alcohol to the extent that it affects their ability to manage their day-to-day living. And the reason I've put those two, I've made them bold, is because I see in my role those two being a person with mental health needs and a person who misuses substances or alcohol, and that's really common and what we see. And I think before now, it's been really difficult at times to get referrals past the front door when you're referring in relation to those areas. But actually, if you go back to the Care Act, and there's reasonable cause to suspect that a person has care and support needs, and is experiencing or at risk of experiencing abuse or neglect, then really it's about kind of challenging that decision if that then comes back out as he doesn't get past the front door. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide is, it's a diagram that a colleague of mine in the Adult Safeguarding Board in Salford created. She came along to our Safeguarding in Housing Forum a little while ago because what we found was that sometimes there was inappropriate referrals being made to the Adult Safeguarding Hub. And what we really needed to do was to try and get people to kind of just be a bit more kind of legal literacy, have a better level of legal literacy and an understanding of the Care Act when making safeguarding referrals. So thinking about, is it safe to have a conversation with the adult? So what's their understanding of the situation? What are their views? What are their wishes and feelings? What do they want to happen? And when you're considering those questions, that in the Care Act, they call it making safeguarding personal. And that's a real key principle as part of the Care Act. And that's around, it should be a person-led and outcome focused. Ideally, it should always include the consent of the adult who the referral is being made about. And it should be around less process driven and more about what the outcome. So kind of what's the view from the adult? You know, being aware of what the consent can, when consent can be overridden. If the adult is at risk or of abuse and neglect, consent to make referral is not needed. So, so it's about working with that adult as far as we can and as much as possible, and about, you know, looking at the best possible outcome for that adult. But if the person is at risk of harm, at risk of abuse and neglect, then just to be clear, that it is lawful to override that consent and to make that referral in. So does the adult have mental capacity to make the decision for themselves? Again, so that's really key. If the adult doesn't have capacity, then again, you are able to override that and make the referral without consent. And then thinking about, again, just touching upon the care and support needs, is it safeguarding? So would this fall under the Care Act? So is there reasonable cause to suspect that an adult has care and support needs, that they're experiencing abuse and neglect, and that the adult is unable to protect himself or herself as a result of their care and support needs? And if the answer to that is yes, then it's met, the Care Act duty is met, and a referral can be made through to the local authority safeguarding hub. If it's not met, but abuse and neglect is suspected, you may well consider getting some advice from the safeguarding hub, or signposting to another support service in the voluntary sector, or maybe even sharing information with partners to kind of try and get a clearer picture. And considering as well, is a multi-agency discussion needed to understand and manage the risks? So this is where there are still some risks, but it doesn't necessarily or neatly fit under those the reasonable cause to suspect, and the adult is vulnerable and has care and support needs. If you're unsure from that first bit around is it safeguarding, it's getting really thinking about what is it that you're worried about, what is the risk to the adult, what's the additional information that you could obtain, have you spoken to the adult, and is a multi-agency discussion needed to understand and assess the risk? And after this, it may still be that it's appropriate to refer into the safeguarding hub. And then I think some of the other key principles on this diagram is around when can I share information without consent. I'm not going to pick this up here because I've got the next slide, which I'll catch it up on there. But just in the top right corner there is around the safeguarding principles. They're called the 6 principles, and that's around prevention, protection, partnership working, proportionality, empowerment, and accountability. And some of the I statements that go with that is around prevention. I receive clear and simple information about what abuse is. I know how to recognise the signs. I know what I can do to seek help. Protection, I can get help and support to report abuse and neglect. I get help so that I'm able to take part in the safeguarding process to the extent to which I want. Partnership, I know that staff treat any person, I know that staff treat any personal and sensitive information in confidence, only sharing what is helpful and necessary, and I'm confident that professionals will work together with me to get the best result for me. Proportionality. So this is around, and the I statement here would be, I am sure that the professionals will work in my interest and that they will only get involved as much as necessary. Empowerment. I am asked what I want as the outcomes from the safeguarding process, and this directly informs what happens. And accountability. Finally, I understand the role of everybody involved in my life, and so do they. So that's, for me, it's very much a whistle-stop tour about some of the key principles of the Care Act. And again, so that's about making safeguarding personal, and that's about keeping the person at the centre and asking the questions about what does the adult want, what's their desired outcome, what would be the best outcome for them. Considering around mental capacity, and if there's any concern around the mental capacity or a person lacking mental capacity, then an assessment would need to be taken around that particular decision. And then thinking about the threshold and whether threshold is met. And like I said before, the threshold for safeguarding under the Care Act standalone duty, and it's much lower. There doesn't need to be receipt or assessment for a care package. And then thinking about when we can share information lawfully and the 6 principles. And for me, they would be some of the key points that I would want you to take away in terms of supporting you in making that referral when you have concerns. Next slide, please. Okay, so information sharing confidentiality. There are a list of statements on here. These are also available on the ANCRAFT website and on the Sky website as well. And this really, for me, was a real kind of nugget of clarity when somebody shared this with me around when can we share information with partners? Well, you know, when would it be lawful to do that? Because I think we get very nervous about doing it. And essentially, it's around sharing the right information at the right time with the right people, and this being fundamental to good practice in safeguarding adults. And because it is often seen or highlighted as a difficult area of practice. And I think, you know, it's fair to say that to safeguard people from harm and abuse, it's essential that information is shared between services and organisations, and that allows us to, I guess, understand the picture. It allows us to assess the risks to the person, and then that kind of leads us to be able to make informed decisions about what actions need to be taken. And I would always throw back out to you, it's important to consider the risks of not sharing information when making a decision, and is that actually going to be to the detriment of the person and keeping the person safe? Okay, can you go to the next slide, please? So what would an effective safeguarding referral look like? Ideally, you would have the consent of the adult to start with, and you would involve them with any ongoing communication. So they're aware, they're kept up to date, they know what's happening to them. So it's a process that's being done with them as opposed to being done to them, and being really clear about the level of risk if the consent is overridden in that circumstance, if that person is at risk of abuse and neglect. Try and include the adult's voice. So keeping the person at the centre, keeping them involved, and keeping a focus on the desired outcome for the adult. So remembering making safeguarding personal. Make sure it's timely, so the referral is made at the earliest point before risks escalate. And be really clear and concise about the risks and the abuse on the referral form. So what has occurred? What action might you have already taken? What attempts have been made to reduce the risk? Or remove the risk, and what is it you're wanting from the referral? So is it a multi-agency strategy meeting where you can bring partners together and it's being dealt with underneath the safeguarding framework? Is it I don't know, but you know, be clear about what it is what might be needed from making that referral. It's not a pass the book and then send to them and then your bit's done. It's an ongoing process that you should remain involved in. There should be evidence of multi-agency communication and information sharing, and it shows then that multi-agency approach has been taken. And this can be pre-referral to establish a fuller picture of the risks, and which would hopefully strengthen the referral. And any evidence of multi-agency meetings, so has there been any professionals meetings before you've made the referral, and where, you know, there has been meetings, but actually the risks remain high to the point that a referral is needed. And it needs to come in for a multidisciplinary team meeting or a strategy meeting. Okay, next slide. So just to think about really what happens when it works well. And I think it's been touched upon before, the value of multi-agency work, and it really, really can't be underestimated. And the value of having a clear multi-agency coordinated plan when you're working with somebody that you're concerned about. But very, very quickly, because I'm conscious of time, I just want to give 3 quick examples of our response to some of the challenges that I highlighted at the beginning in terms of the referrals. And with each of those areas, you know, we had an adult with vulnerabilities, and you know, by working with the other partners, with the other agencies, coming together, and that kind of regular communication, we were able to, I guess, work towards a positive outcome for each of these situations, each of these cases. So in the first one, you know, we had a young man who had been rough sleeping for a number of years. We were really struggling to get him to engage, and referrals were being bounced out. And what ended up happening was, it was seen like, actually, we need to change our approach. So the assessment, the mental health assessment, actually took place at his bedded down site, where there was an adult social care practitioner, there was a supported housing practitioner who had the relationship with the adult. The police were there as well in case they were also needed. It did lead to the adult being sectioned and then spending some time as an inpatient, but he's since come out of there. He's in his own property and he's settled and maintaining a tenancy. Not saying he doesn't have mental health issues and challenges anymore, he does. However, it's being managed and he's not on the street. He's now got a roof over his head and settled. The self-neglect, we had an elderly lady living in a property, very poor state of disrepair, concerns about the property and needing to get in there, concerns about whether she had capacity. And again, we pulled, you know, a meeting together with some of the key services there and involved our regulatory services and looked at what powers and that they had, that, you know, to work to carry out the work in there. And it involved, you know, using a community PCSOs that the lady was familiar with. So they were on hand on that day. There was a plan about who would be there. There was communication with the lady about who would be going into the property and what would be being done. And you know, this led now to the work being able to be carried out with the least amount of disruption to the lady in her home. And now we know that she's living in a home that can, you know, it's got heating, it's warm, it's safe, and it's comfortable for her to be in there. And then the cuckoo exploitation, again, just to reiterate really that this was another area that it couldn't be done. It couldn't be done on our own. It couldn't be, you know, tackled and resolved just by housing, working with the tenant. This had to be a multi-agency approach, and that was the referrals going in and also then the management of that case coming out. And I guess, you know, I think Darren picked up on earlier, when it works well, you know, when that multi-agency working is in place, it works really well. But it's making sure that, you know, we use those processes that are there, the framework, the legislative framework that's in place, and we use it to strengthen our practice when it comes to making adult safeguarding referrals. I think that's it. I realise I've galloped through that. So if there are any questions that you have, then please direct them and I'll hopefully do my best to answer those. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Forbes Solicitors Safeguarding webinar. I'm Rebecca Webster. I'm an associate at Forbes Solicitors and I work in the ASB litigation team in the housing team. I'm going to be talking about safeguarding today, what it is. I'll go over the Care Act and duties of the local authority. I'll go into a bit about abuse and self-neglect, the role of the housing provider, training and awareness, sharing of information, and then I'll end with some case studies. So what is safeguarding? Safeguarding means protecting an adult's right to live in safety, free from abuse and neglect. It's about people and organisations working together to prevent and stop both the risks of experience of abuse or neglect, while at the same time making sure that the adult's well-being is promoted, including where appropriate, having regard to their views, wishes, feelings and beliefs in deciding on any action. So the Care Act came into effect on the 1st of April 2015. It introduced a single statutory framework for looking after people with needs for care and support, and it introduced many new principles and duties on local authorities and other agency partners, including needs assessments and provisions to safeguarding. The Act sets out a clear legal framework for how local authorities and other parts of the system should protect adults at risk of abuse and neglect. And the Section 42 places a duty on local authorities to make inquiries or to ask others to make inquiries where they reasonably suspect that an adult in its area is at risk of neglect or abuse, including financial abuse. And the purpose of the inquiry is to establish with the individual or the representatives what, if any, action is required in relation to the situation, and to establish who should take action. It supplements the existing obligation on other organisations to look after the people in their care effectively, or in the case of the police, to prevent and respond to criminal activity. So the local authority has duties, and those are to promote individuals' well-being, to prevent needs for care and support, to promote integration of care and support with health services, and cooperation. There are 6 key principles that underpin all adult safeguarding work, and the first of which is empowerment. People being supported and encouraged to make their own decisions and informed consent. So the question is, for the person involved, am I asked what it is that I want as the outcomes from the safeguarding process, and are these directly informed? And am I directly informed of what happens? So empowerment promotes independence and well-being. The person's given control over and supporting to make choices about their lives. The next one is prevention, and it's better to take action before harm occurs. And the question or the statement here is that I receive clear and simple information about what abuse is, how to recognise the signs, and what I can do to seek help. And the aim of that principle is to prevent rather than to react. And this should be reflected in policies and day-to-day activities. Proportionality is third, and it's the least intrusive response appropriate to the risk presented. So when you're faced with a safeguarding situation, you need to consider what is the least intrusive response. The statement here is, I am sure that the professionals will work in my interests as I see them, and they will only get involved as much as needed. The fourth principle is protection. Support and representation for those in greatest need. The statement here is, I get help and support to report abuse and neglect. I get help so that I am able to take part in the safeguarding process to the extent to which I want. The fifth is partnership, local solutions through services working with their communities. Communities have a part to play in preventing, detecting and reporting neglect and abuse. And this statement is, I know that staff treat any personal and sensitive information in confidence, only sharing what is helpful and necessary. And I am confident that professionals will work together and with me to get the best result for me. And the final principle is accountability. Accountability and transparency in delivering safeguarding. The statement here is, I understand the role of everyone involved in my life, and so do they. So I touched on very briefly Section 42 of the Care Act 2014, but it's sections 42 and 47 that put adult safeguarding on a statutory footing for the first time. And like I said, local authorities have a duty now to make inquiries or cause other partners to do so if it believes an adult is experiencing or is at risk of abuse or neglect and are unable to protect themselves against the actual risk of abuse and neglect. And the inquiry should establish whether any action needs to be taken to prevent or stop abuse or neglect, and if so, by who. And the Act puts cooperation on a statutory footing with each of its relevant partners in order to protect the adult. In their turn, each relevant partner must also cooperate with the local authority, and that's in section 45. Now, this is a clear shift in culture from adult social care services being a reactive service to becoming a proactive one. and it puts preventing needs for care and support and promoting integration and care and support with health services at the forefront. Each local authority must also set up safeguarding adult boards, which is at section 43, and those boards must conduct reviews of cases where an adult has either died and the board knows or suspects the death was from abuse or neglect, or survived a known or suspected serious abuse or neglect, and that's at section 44. So safeguarding duties apply to any adult who has a need for care and support, whether or not the local authority is meeting any of those needs. Adults who are experiencing or are at risk of abuse and neglect, and as a result of those care and support needs, they are unable to protect themselves from either the risk of or the experience of abuse and neglect. There's no eligibility criteria for an adult safeguarding service. If an adult is at risk of being abused or neglected and cannot keep themselves safe from abuse or neglect because of their care and support needs, then the local authority's safeguarding duties apply. If they are unable to protect themselves despite having care and support needs, then a safeguarding response may not be appropriate. The local authorities are responsible for looking at any safeguarding concerns which are raised with them and about any adult who has a care and support need, and deciding whether it's necessary to carry out an inquiry. Consideration should be given to the wishes and preferences of the persons concerned, as it's a person-led duty. So there are non-statutory inquiries, and these are known as other safeguarding inquiries, and these may be carried out or instigated by local authorities in response to concerns about adults who do not have care and support needs, but who may still be at risk of abuse or neglect, and to whom the local authority has a wellbeing duty under Section 1 of the Care Act. So wellbeing relates to personal dignity, physical and mental health and emotional well-being, protection from abuse and neglect, control by individuals over their day-to-day life, participation in work, education, training or recreation, social and economic well-being, domestic, family and personal relationships, suitability of living accommodation, and the individual's contribution to society. Adults at risk may have mental or physical illness, have a learning disability, have addiction problems, or be frail. People may be at greater risk because they are socially isolated, which may provide an opportunity for exploitation. They may be unsure of who to trust. They may be dependent on others to manage their finances or to withdraw or collect money for them. Or they are unable to escape abuse, or they tolerate it due to their reliance on the abuser. Domestic violence springs to mind here. There may be an adapted accommodation or have a lack of suitable accommodation and care provision. And housing providers are in a position to spot these risks and patterns because they're on the ground on a day-to-day basis. Signs of abuse are often difficult to detect, and it's vital that housing staff are able to identify abuse and recognise possible indicators. People with communication difficulties can be particularly at risk because they may not be able to alert others, and people may not be able to, may not even be aware that they're being abused, and this is especially likely if they have a cognitive impairment. And abusers may try to prevent access to the person they abuse. So what constitutes abuse or neglect? The statutory guidance identifies 10 types of abuse: physical abuse, domestic, sexual, psychological, financial or material, modern slavery, discrimination, organisation, neglect and acts of omission, and self-neglect. Physical abuse are things like assault, hitting, slapping, pushing, restraint, and an inappropriate physical sanctions. Domestic violence can include psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial, emotional, and so-called honour-based violence. Sexual abuse can include rape, indecent exposure, sexual harassment, inappropriate looking or touching, teasing or innuendo, sexual photography, subjection to pornography or witnessing sexual acts, and sexual acts to which the adult has not consented or was pressured into. Psychological abuse includes emotional abuse, threats of harm or abandonment, deprivation of contact, humiliation, blaming, controlling, intimidation, coercion, harassment, the list goes on and on. But cyberbullying is included in that, as is isolation. Financial and material abuse or material abuse includes theft, fraud, internet scamming, coercion in relation to an adult's financial affairs or arrangements, and the misuse or misappropriation of property, possession, or benefits. Slavery, modern slavery includes slavery, human trafficking, forced labour and domestic servitude, traffickers and slave masters using whatever means they have at their disposal to coerce, deceive, and force individuals into a life of abuse, servitude, and inhumane treatment. Discriminatory abuse includes harassment, slurs, or similar treatment because of race, gender, gender identity, age, disability, sexual orientation, and religion. Organisational abuse includes neglect and poor care practice within an institution or specific care setting, such as a hospital or care home, for example, or in relation to care provided in one's own home. This may range from one-off incidents to ongoing ill treatment. It can be through neglect or poor professional practice as a result of the structure, policies, processes, and practices within the organisation. Neglect and acts of omission include ignoring medical, emotional, or physical care needs and failure to provide access to appropriate health care or support or educational needs, and the withholding of the necessities of life, such as medication, adequate nutrition, and heating. Self-neglect, I'll come on to this next in a bit more detail, but this covers a wide range of behaviour, neglecting to care for one's personal hygiene, health, or surroundings, and includes behaviours such as hoarding. It should be noted that the self-neglect may not prompt a Section 42 inquiry, and an assessment should be made on a case-by-case basis. A decision on whether response is required under safeguarding will depend on the adult's ability to protect themselves by controlling their own behaviour, and there may become a point when they are no longer able to do this without external support. So self-neglect can be a complex and challenging issue for practitioners to address because of the need to find the right balance between respecting a person's autonomy and fulfilling their duty to protect the adult's health and well-being. And both perspectives can be supported by human rights arguments. And in some circumstances where there's a serious risk to the health and well-being of an individual, it may be appropriate to raise self-neglect as a safeguarding concern. However, bear in mind that interventions on self-neglect are usually more appropriate under the parts of the Care Act dealing with assessment, planning, information and advice and prevention. And it's vital to establish whether the person has capacity to make their decisions about their own well-being and whether or not they're able or willing to care for themselves. An adult who is able to make choices may make decisions that others think of as self-neglect, but they don't. And if that person doesn't want any safeguarding action to be taken, it may be reasonable not to intervene further as long as no one else is at risk. Their vital interests are not compromised, and that all decisions are fully explained and recorded, and agencies have been informed and involved as necessary. So who abuses and neglects adults? Well, anybody can, and I've just rounded up here those that are pretty regular. So spouses and partners, other family members, neighbours, friends, acquaintances, local residents, people who deliberately exploit adults they're perceiving as vulnerable to abuse, for example, cuckooing and financial abuse, etc. And then paid staff or professionals and volunteers, so carers who come into the property or care staff in a care home, and strangers who target individuals for fraud and internet scams. So where there are safeguarding concerns that arise from abuse or neglect, it would not only be necessary to immediately consider what steps are needed to protect the adult, but also whether to refer the matter to the police, consider whether a criminal investigation would be required or is appropriate. You must remember that abuse may consist of a single or repeated act, and it may be physical, verbal, or psychological, and an act of neglect or omission to act. In any case, when you encounter abuse and you are uncertain about your next steps, you should contact the police for advice. And defining abuse can be complex, but it can involve intentional, reckless, deliberate, or dishonest acts by the person who's perpetrating the abuse. So I'm going to come on to relevant partners because the Care Act does state that the local authority must cooperate with their relevant partners. And these include NHS, clinical commissioning groups, NHS trusts and foundation trusts, the Department for Work and Pensions, the police, prisons and probation services, private registered providers of social housing are the partners that the local authority may cooperate with, and it's very, very important that they do, because as I've said before, housing associations, housing providers are on the ground and are usually the first to spot the signs of abuse. So housing staff are important partners because they have the local knowledge of antisocial behaviour and crime. They're usually the first to become aware of an individual developing care and support needs as a result of age, disability or illness. They're aware of people with care and support needs who are not known to social services, and they're in a position to pick up signs of abuse and neglect when visiting tenants. Housing partners should have representations at a strategic level across public protection forums. And the forums can include safeguarding boards, multi-agency risk assessment conferences, multi-agency public protection arrangements, and health and wellbeing boards and community safety partnerships. So the issues for housing are, well, firstly, but there can be complex networks where housing providers may have to work with several local authorities in their area and vice versa. So they may have stock in one council district and another council district, or more than one. So that's where the complex networks can cause an issue. There are reports of local authorities being reluctant to get involved where they are concerned about an individual who's not eligible for social care support. That's another barrier. Reports of negative attitudes towards them from social care professionals as well. Another thing is that IT systems of housing providers may be inadequate to source sensitive data and to facilitate customer profiling that can tell them who may be more vulnerable for effective safeguarding. And there may be a limited understanding of issues relating to consent and capacity and when information should be shared. So there are several ways in which housing providers can contribute to a preventative approach on safeguarding. They're well placed to identify adults who have the care and support needs and may be at risk of abuse. And some serious case reviews have concluded in the past that housing providers could play a more effective role in safeguarding. So it is important for local authorities to cooperate with housing providers as a matter of course. So the preventative approach does include raising general public awareness of what constitutes abuse and how to report it, to educate tenants on how to recognise abuse and protect themselves from it, ensure that individuals have access to support from social services and voluntary support agencies and health, work with perpetrators of antisocial behaviour to try and reduce their behaviour and minimise risks, ensure staff training that includes prevention, and have systems in place to facilitate the identification of people with care and support needs and possible risks. As well, they should have mechanisms in place to identify people who may pose a risk, make strategic links with safeguarding adult boards and other multi-agency public protection forums, ensure that staff understand and follow multi-agency policies and procedures, seek to address social exclusion and isolation through local joint strategies with other agencies, and to promote interagency collaboration. And finally, to ensure that allocations policies considers a risk to tenants who may be vulnerable to abuse. In terms of training and awareness for housing providers, multi-agencies policies and procedures should be in place to ensure that staff are clear about roles and responsibilities, and when a safeguarding concern should be raised, and when and how information should be shared. This raises awareness of abuse for everyone, staff, contractors and tenants, and ensures appropriate safeguarding training is provided to all workers at all levels. Training should tap into joint training with other safeguarding partners as well, and it must ensure housing staff have an adequate understanding of the Mental Capacity Act 2005, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. To provide training for people with care and support needs to enable them to better protect themselves. If there's no safeguarding team in your organisation, it would be helpful to have a safeguarding lead, and this role could be allocated to a senior manager, for example. The training should take place, I believe, at all levels in the organisation and be updated regularly to reflect current best practice. Basic mandatory induction training with respect to awareness of spotting signs of abuse and the duty to report should be included as well. Awareness training, including training on recognition of abuse and responsibilities with respect to procedures. It should include specialist training for those who will be undertaking inquiries. For example, call centre staff should be trained specifically to identify and detect instances where a safeguarding concern is raised, and then advanced training for those who work with more complex inquiries and responses, or who acts as their organisation expert in that particular field. So, example, safeguarding teams or the safeguarding lead. An organisation should recognise their critical role in preventing and detecting abuse, and ensure that practice is consistent and no staff group is excluded. Moving on to sharing information. Early sharing of information is the key to providing an effective response where there are emerging concerns. And all organisations must have arrangements in place which set out clearly the processes and the principles for sharing information between each other, with other professionals and the boards. This could be by information sharing agreements to formalise the arrangements. It should not be assumed that someone else will pass on the information, which may be critical to the safety and well-being of an adult. If anybody has a concern about an adult's welfare and believes they're suffering or likely to suffer abuse or neglect, then they should share that information with the local authority and or the police if they believe that or suspect that a crime has been committed. And it's paramount to understand local interagency policies and procedures when sharing information. These should reflect the statutory guidance and everybody should know about them. So, because safeguarding is a person-led approach, you're pretty much bound to get the individual's consent or agreement to share information about them, and if it's refused or it's asked that they're not shared with other safeguarding partners, their wishes should be respected as far as possible. A balance needs to be struck between sticking strictly to procedures to protect adults who may be at risk and responding to the needs, wishes and circumstances of those individual people. So sharing information without consent. So if they've said that they don't want you to share that information, there are certain circumstances where you can, and that's where the person lacks the mental capacity to make that decision, and sharing the information is in their best interests, or where other people are or maybe at risk, and that includes children, where sharing the information could prevent a crime or a serious crime has been committed, and where the person has mental capacity to make the decision, but where they may be under duress or being coerced, where the risk is unreasonably high and meets the criteria for a multi-agency risk assessment conference referral, and where a court order or other legal authority has requested the information. Just to note that GDPR is not a barrier to sharing information, but provides a framework to ensure personal information is shared appropriately. So going back there, if those circumstances, any of those circumstances arise, then you are able to share that information without the individual's consent. But if you are in doubt, please do seek advice. So there are 5 key principles to the Mental Capacity Act. And that the first one is there is a presumption of capacity without evidence of there not being capacity. Individuals are to be encouraged to support and supported to make their own decisions. And every person has a right to make their own decisions, but must be assumed to have capacity to do so, unless, like I said, unless it's proved otherwise. And if a person has capacity, they are entitled to make their own decisions, even if they are unwise or eccentric. Although if others are put at risk, it may be justified to disclose information without consent. If a person doesn't have capacity, a decision will need to be made in their best interests. And in terms of best interest, anything done for or on behalf of the person who lacks mental capacity must comply with the Mental Capacity Act. And in terms of less restrictive interventions, it's a balancing exercise. Intervention should be weighed up in the particular circumstances of the case. And where there's no capacity, you must consider whether it's possible to decide or act in a way that would interfere less with the person's rights and freedoms, or whether there's a need to decide at all. Right, so I'm going to go on to a couple of case studies now, and the first one is Mr. S. So Mr. S is in his early 60s and lives in a housing association flat. He has no recorded disabilities or mental health issues and is not known to adult services. He is supported by his sister, who has authority to act as his advocate with the housing provider. The tenant's sister has advised that he suffers with his mental health, but has not disclosed any specific diagnosis. Mr. S has allegedly spent a period of time in hospital, and the condition of the property is such that it indicates he has some mental health issues, in particular hoarding. So the issue here is that in 2019, an elderly neighbour reported a damp mold problem in their property and also in the communal areas, and concerns were raised by the neighbour's family members. And it transpires that the damp had been an issue for over a year prior to it being reported, so it's quite bad and potentially is affecting the neighbour's health. The landlord made numerous appointments to inspect the property over the course of a couple of years, and it's still actually going on today. And each was cancelled by the sister, stating the problem did not concern the property, and in any event, she would need to be present at any arranged appointment. The tenant was given notice that entry would be forced to inspect the property, and invited the tenant to contact them to avoid it. He didn't respond, and when the landlord attended to force entry, they discovered the door had been barricaded, and Mr. S was behind it screaming to be left alone, and he became abusive to the contractors. They considered it unsafe to enter, and so they withdrew. Further appointment letters were sent and ignored, and ad hoc visits were made, but were unsuccessful. The sister was contacted throughout this process and was obstructive, refused to provide her correspondence address and argued that the appointment was unnecessary. When pre-action correspondence and action was taken, the sister became aggressive, called the landlord monsters, and said, "You'll have to go to court as you ain't getting in." And throughout the process, the tenant and his sister were invited to discuss any personal circumstances which may be impacted on his ability to manage and sustain his tenancy, which would enable the landlord to determine whether any referrals could be made to assist him. Neither the tenant nor his sister ever responded. So that culminated in an injunction application for access, which was granted on the 8th of June 2021. And in early July 2021, a referral was made to adult services due to concerns that the sister was controlling the tenant by not letting him allow access into the property and being very obstructive. So following the injunction, access was granted, but only to the hallway and wet room. And it was discovered that a full refurbishment of the wet room was required, but works couldn't be carried out due to the contractors not being able to access the electrics and stop tap. The contractors advised that the general condition of the property was poor and unsuitable to carry out work safely, potentially a hoarding issue there. So further appointments for refurbishment works, a full property inspection and an asbestos survey were made and failed. And these are in breach of the injunction order. Again, invitations for Mr. S to raise any issues affecting his ability to maintain his tenancy were made, but met with no response. Recently, just this month, social services attended a meeting with the landlord, and they have confirmed that Mr. S is not known to their service, but is to be allocated a social worker. And now the landlord is considering issuing a notice seeking possession, which could ultimately lead to his eviction. So an analysis of this case is that the adult of risk is Mr. S. The indicators of need for care and support is that his sister's assertions that he has mental health issues, has been hospitalised, he's barricaded himself in the property and screaming to be left alone. And it was also, we were also advised that he was cleaning himself in a cupboard with wet wipes. The indicators of abuse and neglect in this case was the landlord was only able to contact the sister. The sister had been obstructive and aggressive. She had prevented access and refused access without her being present. So those were the indicators of abuse. The sister was the abuser. And the possible abuse and neglect is psychological, controlling and isolation, and neglect, failure to provide access to property, a failure to provide access to appropriate services like social services, health services, etc. So with consent to share information, no consent was given by either Mr. S or his sister, and mental capacity is presumed in line with the Mental Capacity Act. So this means that one of those conditions for sharing information must be prevalent if you want to share some information. So the justification for the referral to the local authority in this instance was that he was presumed to have mental capacity, but they may be under duress or being coerced. And that's one of those it's one of the lists that you can share information without consent. So the outcome of referral, actually I've received information on this only this morning, and no action was taken. Social services spoke to the sister and another sister, and they were satisfied that there were no care and support needs, so no further action was taken. But now in March 2022, he is being allocated to social worker, which hasn't been done as yet, as far as I'm aware. So there is a reluctancy of social services to get involved initially when the initial safeguarding referral was made. but now it's proceeded to potentially possession proceedings. Social services are going to allocate the social worker. Going on to Mr. L, this is completely different. Mr. L is the perpetrator of antisocial behaviour. He's an adult and a tenant of a housing association flat since October 2020. He regularly allows an excessive amount of non-residential youths, non-resident youths into the block, who then engage in antisocial behaviour, use drugs and cause damage to the stairwell, which causes a nuisance and disturbance to other residents, and they feel intimidated by them. Mr. L admits to being a drug user, so he's potentially a person at risk, being a drug user stroke addict, and is suspected to have vulnerabilities, but is unwilling to discuss his personal circumstances. He admitted to previously letting youths in, but their behaviour has escalated to them kicking in the door for access. Numerous visits have been made to Mr. L, and he was initially offered support and asked if he was being coerced or forced into allowing the youths into the communal areas in his property, but it was denied and support was declined. Mr. L later admitted the flat was being used for drugs, for cannabis use, but not named visitors, as he didn't want to be labelled a grass. So the landlord was granted access in May 2021, but only to the hallway and living room. Further support was offered, and he said he needed support to move to another house, but no other support needs. And in a telephone conversation, he advised that he was being bullied, and this was followed up with offers of support, which he again refused, and he would not provide details of perpetrators. So in considering enforcement options, the landlord carried out a proportionality assessment, which recorded Mr. L as presenting as a weak character in stature and personality, who in all likelihood does come under pressure to allow the user to use his flat. Now, antisocial behaviour continues, and the police have executed a warrant in July, and items associated with drugs misuse were recovered. And then again in November 21, the police attended the flat following an incident of stabbing. And November again, a drugs warrant was executed, and Mr. L and 4 others were arrested for drugs offences. He continues to allow lots of visitors to the flat, causing disturbance and nuisance to neighbours, and the police are currently considering a closure order. There is potential cuckooing on this case, and safeguarding being a person-led approach with their wishes need to be taken into account means the least intrusive response should be taken. So because he hasn't asked for any support or does not want any support, there's not very much further that they can do. So we'll go to the analysis of Mr. L. He is the adult at risk of potential cuckooing. He's got a drug addiction, which is one of the signs of an adult at risk. The indicators of abuse and neglect: he's been intimidated by youth. He has admitted that. The youths are abusers, drug dealers, etc. And the abuse may be intimidation, psychological intimidation. He's not given consent to share any information. There's no capacity concerns. He has a right to make his own decisions, even if they are unwise. There's no extenuating circumstances to warrant a referral here, and his wishes should be respected. Well, thank you for watching the webinar to the end. If you do have any questions, you can contact me on the following details: rebecca.webster@forbessolicitors.co.uk, or you can call me on my mobile on 07976 253 333. Thanks for watching. Bye.